April 7, 1945, a dying army, a broken rail yard, and a German boy in a coat made for a grown man standing outside a prisoner pen with a rifle across his chest. Only one detail made the American patrol stop breathing. The rifle had no bolt. The boy had taken it out himself. Behind him, 13 American prisoners were pressed against a fence made from orchard wire and scrap timber. Some were barefoot. 2 were coughing blood into rags. 1 was too weak to lift his head from a pile of damp straw, and the boy, 15 years old, was holding an American canteen full of beet soup he had cooked in a coal scuttle. When the first sergeant raised his carbine, one of the prisoners dragged himself upright and shouted through cracked lips, "Don't shoot him." That was the sentence that changed the morning. Not an order, not a report, not a white flag. Just one prisoner, half-starved, protecting the enemy guard. The patrol belonged to an advance element of Patton's Third Army, pushing east through central Germany in the last weeks of the war. They had already seen towns surrender before the tanks arrived. They had seen old men with armbands throw rifles into ditches. They had seen boys in oversized uniforms stare at American armor as if it had come from another planet. But this was different. The makeshift camp sat behind a burned freight shed near a village no map in the column bothered naming. It had not been built to last. It had been thrown together because a train carrying prisoners had stopped. The line ahead had been bombed, and the German unit responsible for them had nowhere else to put the men, so they used what was left, a cattle enclosure, a cracked stove, a locked tool room, wire, mud, a guard roster that collapsed before the front even arrived. The boy's name was Emil Roth. He was 15. His father had vanished somewhere beyond the Don 2 winters earlier. His mother had died in an air raid the previous autumn. Emil had been pulled into a Luftwaffe auxiliary detail, then reassigned as a messenger, then abandoned into whatever the German war had become by April of 1945. No one had asked if he understood military law. No one had asked if he knew how to fire the Mauser. No one had asked if he was still a child. They gave him a coat, a rifle, and a place beside the wire. Then the adults disappeared. First, the supply sergeant left with the last sacks of flour. Then the 2 regular guards walked west at dawn and never came back. Last came an SS corporal, who searched the prisoners for watches, beat a man named James Cardwell for hiding a photograph of his wife, and told Emil that if the Americans were still alive when the front arrived, the boy would be blamed. That was the last order Emil received from the Reich: kill the sick men. Or run. He did neither. After the corporal left, Emil stood at the gate until the sound of his boots vanished down the road. Then he took the bolt out of his rifle, wrapped it in a rag, and buried it under a fence post. He unlocked the tool room. He found 2 dented buckets, a sack of horse beets, a half jar of salt, and a canvas sheet stiff with frost. He cut the sheet into strips for bandages. He boiled the beets until the water turned purple and thin. He used a canteen taken from a dead American pack because it did not leak. For 3 nights he walked between the pen and the freight shed, carrying water, soup, and scraps of firewood. Not enough to save anyone properly, just enough to keep death from getting organized. The prisoners did not know what to make of him. He was still in German uniform. He still stood outside the fence. He still had the shape of the enemy. But he never pointed the useless rifle at them. He never ate until they had eaten. And when Cardwell's fever got so bad that he began calling for his wife in the dark, Emil sat against the outside of the wire and answered him in the only English he knew. "Here, I am here," he said it again and again, not because it solved anything, but because silence seemed cruel. By the time the Americans reached the camp, Emil had slept less than 2 hours in 3 days. His feet were frostburned. His hands were cracked open from carrying hot metal without gloves. And 13 American soldiers were still alive. Sergeant Louis Tanner was the first man through the gate. He expected a trap. Everyone expected a trap in April of 1945. Doorways were traps. White flags were sometimes traps. Dead vehicles in the road could be traps. A child with a rifle could absolutely be a trap. So Tanner kept his weapon high while the translator, Corporal Henry Mark, shouted for the boy to put the gun down. Emil obeyed immediately. The Mauser hit the mud. The sound was too light. Tanner looked down, saw the empty receiver, and understood something had already happened here that none of his training covered. Inside the pen, Cardwell pulled himself up by the wire. "He's the reason we're breathing," he said. His voice barely worked. Tanner looked from the prisoner to the boy, then to the canteen still swinging from Emil's hand. It was American issue, olive drab, one strap torn and reedied with string. 7 dog tags were looped through that string, not trophies, names. Emil had tied them there because the sick men kept losing track of whose canteen was whose, and he did not want the wrong fever medicine, the wrong water ration, or the wrong note passed to the wrong man. That detail moved through the patrol faster than any official report could have. The German guard was keeping records for American prisoners. The boy with the rifle had disarmed himself. The enemy had stayed after the real enemy ran. Then the military police arrived, and the war became official again. Procedure did not care that Emil was shaking. Procedure did not care that Cardwell said the boy had saved him. Procedure saw a male in enemy uniform, armed at the time of capture, exercising control over Allied prisoners in a hostile facility. Those words had weight. They had been written for a reason. By spring of 1945, American soldiers had seen German boys younger than Emil fire Panzerfausts from ditches. They had watched civilians wave from windows while mines waited under the road. They had learned the hard way that pity could be a doorway men died walking through. So when Lieutenant Colonel Arden Pike, the military police commander attached to the sector, arrived at the camp, he did not see a miracle. He saw a legal problem. He saw risk. He saw precedent. He saw the danger of letting emotion rewrite rules while the shooting had not yet stopped. "Enemy personnel," Pike said. Cardwell heard the phrase from the stretcher. He raised himself on one elbow and said with the last strength he had, "Then charge me with desertion because I'm going wherever he goes." No one laughed, not even the men who wanted to. The report went upward before noon. The field commander did not want to decide it. Division Legal did not want to decide it. Everyone knew the war was nearly over. Everyone also knew that nearly over was not over. Then word came back that made the yard go silent. General George S. Patton was within driving distance. He wanted to see the boy himself. There are names that enter a camp before the man does. Patton was one of them. To his soldiers he was speed, fury, precision, temper, belief, and fear compressed into one polished helmet. Officers checked their maps twice when they heard he was coming. Men stood straighter even when they were wounded. His reputation arrived first, rattling through every rank like metal on stone. Emil did not know the stories. Marx translated only what mattered. A senior American general was coming, a man with authority to decide what happened to him. Emil asked whether the general would be angry. Marx looked at the boy's hands, purple and split from cold. Then he looked at the 13 prisoners who had just told the same impossible story. "I don't know," Marx said. That was the honest answer. Patton arrived without ceremony. A staff car, 2 jeeps, boots in the mud, a helmet too clean for that yard, ivory-handled pistols at his hips. He did not shout. That frightened the officers more than shouting would have. He walked the perimeter slowly. He looked at the wire, the stove, the freight shed, the dead fire, the straw where the sick men had lain. He listened to the field report. He listened to the military police position. He listened to Cardwell, who had to stop twice because his lungs would not give him enough air. Then Patton asked to see the rifle. Tanner handed it over. Patton opened the receiver. Empty. "Where's the bolt?" he asked. Marx translated. Emil pointed to the fence post. A private dug into the mud with a bayonet and found the rag bundle in less than a minute. The bolt was inside, wrapped dry, useless unless the boy chose to put it back. Patton held it in his palm. No one spoke. A rifle without a bolt is not mercy by accident. It is a decision. Patton looked at Emil for a long moment. Then he asked, slowly enough for each word to cross the language barrier intact, "Who told you to take it out?" Marx translated. Emil shook his head. "No one. Why did you do it?" The boy swallowed. "Because if I kept it ready," he said, "someone might make me use it." That answer did what artillery could not have done. It emptied the yard, not physically, but morally. Every man there understood the sentence. The boy had not trusted his country. He had not trusted his orders. He had not even trusted his own fear. So he made the rifle less dangerous than the war wanted it to be. Patton turned toward the prisoners. "Did he strike any of you?" No hands rose. "Did he deny food or water?" No hands rose. "Did he threaten you?" Cardwell answered from the stretcher. "He threatened us once, sir." That made the officers stiffen. Cardwell coughed, then kept going. "He said if we didn't drink the beet water, he'd pour it down our throats. That was the threat." A sound moved through the Americans, not laughter, something too tired to become laughter. Patton did not smile. He looked back at Emil and asked the question that would stay with every man who heard it. "When your army ordered you to guard enemies, what did you decide they were?" Marx translated. Emil stared at the mud. His answer came quietly. "Hungry." That was all. Not Americans, not enemies, not prisoners. Hungry. Patton took one step closer. He reached up and removed the Luftwaffe cap from Emil's head. The boy flinched, then held still. The cap looked absurd in Patton's hand. Too large, too dirty, too much history for one child's head. Patton handed it to Marx. "Get him out of that uniform," he said. Then he turned to the military police. "Feed him, treat his feet. Take his statement. Civilian protective custody, not prisoner detention, unless I personally countermand it." Lieutenant Colonel Pike opened his mouth, then closed it. Patton saw him. "You can write your objections," he said. "Write them neatly." Then Patton looked at the 13 Americans behind the wire. "The prisoners get medical evacuation first. Names transmitted before dark. Families notified through official notice." He started toward the car, stopped, and turned back once. His voice dropped, not soft, lower than soft. "War has taken enough boys and taught them to call it duty. When one of them remembers what duty was supposed to protect, we had better be wise enough to notice." No one answered. There was nothing to add. The order solved the moment. It did not solve the system. 3 days later, in a requisitioned municipal office 20 miles west of the camp, Lieutenant Colonel Pike filed his objection exactly as Patton had invited him to do. It was not emotional, it was not cruel. That made it harder to dismiss. Pike argued that the Army could not create informal exemptions for enemy uniformed personnel based on field impressions, even sympathetic ones. He noted that German youth formations had been used in combat. He noted that American casualties had resulted from children carrying weapons. He noted that confusion in classification could endanger soldiers and civilians alike. He was right about all of that. That was the uncomfortable part. Rules exist because chaos kills. But rules also fail when the world creates a case they were not built to understand. Captain Daniel Reeves, the officer who had been present at the rail yard, carried the prisoner's statements to a judge advocate named Major Paul Sutter. Sutter had spent months reading files on camp guards, forced labor, summary shootings, and every form of cruelty that official language could make smaller, never erase. He read Cardwell's statement first, then Tanner's, then the medic's report. Emil Roth, age 15, severe malnutrition, frost injury to both feet, split tissue across palms, no evidence of food hoarding, evidence consistent with voluntary deprivation while distributing available food to others. Sutter read that line twice. Then he wrote one sentence on a legal pad. The weapon was disabled by the subject before contact with U.S. forces. That was the hinge. Not sentiment, not pity, proof. The boy had made himself less dangerous before it benefited him to appear harmless. A review board convened 9 days later in a schoolhouse with blast paper still taped across the windows. 4 officers sat at 2 pushed-together desks. A stove smoked in the corner. Outside, German civilians waited in a ration line under a sky the color of old tin. Cardwell was carried in on a litter. He insisted on sitting up. He testified that Emil had fed the prisoners before feeding himself. He testified that the boy had warned them when the SS corporal threatened to shoot the sick. He testified that Emil had stayed awake through one entire night because a man named O'Rourke was choking on fever and needed to be turned every few minutes so he would not drown in his own lungs. Pike asked one question. "Did the boy have authority over you?" Cardwell looked at him. "Yes," he said, "and he used it better than the men who gave it to him." That sentence ended the room's patience for pretending the case was ordinary. The board reclassified Emil as a protected civilian minor who had acted in defense of Allied lives. His detention record was removed. His statement remained attached to the file, but not as a charge, as evidence. When Marx explained the decision to him, Emil did not ask where he would go. He did not ask whether he was free. He asked, "The men from the fence, did they live?" Marx told him what he knew. All 13 had survived evacuation. Cardwell's fever had broken. O'Rourke was breathing on his own. A prisoner named Miller had dictated a letter to his sister in Iowa because his hands were too swollen to hold a pencil. Emil nodded. Then he folded the paper and put it inside the jacket the Red Cross had given him. The first official document of his new life. History prefers large things: armies, maps, capitals, surrenders, generals with statues, photographs of flags raised over ruined buildings. It does not know what to do with a boy beside a wire fence, carrying beet water in a stolen canteen. So the story nearly disappeared. The camp was dismantled. The freight shed was cleared. The road was repaired. The village name vanished into other paperwork. The 13 men went home in pieces, the way prisoners come home when the body arrives before the mind is ready to follow. James Cardwell returned to St. Louis in June 1945. For 3 weeks, he slept on the floor beside his bed because the mattress felt too soft and too high. His wife, Ruth, stopped asking questions he could not answer. She left coffee where he could reach it and waited. One night he told her about the boy. Not the whole story. Just this much. There was a German kid, he said. He took the bolt out of his own rifle so nobody could make him shoot us. Ruth sat with that for a long time. Then she asked, "What was his name?" Cardwell said, "Emil." And because she understood that survival sometimes depends on preserving one small proof against all the larger darkness, she wrote it down. Emil. O'Rourke went back to Massachusetts with a damaged lung and a habit of standing near exits. Miller returned to Iowa and kept the letter he had dictated in the hospital, folded in a tobacco tin. Tanner stayed in the Army for another 7 years and never forgot the sound of that useless rifle falling into the mud. They carried the story because the official record could not carry its weight. It could state what happened. It could not explain what it meant to owe your life to a child raised under the flag you had crossed an ocean to defeat. Emil passed through 2 relief homes before landing with a widow named Greta Falk in Kassel, a woman who had lost both sons and had decided that an empty room was an accusation unless someone slept in it. He was quiet, careful with food, careful with doors, careful with every kindness. As if kindness might be withdrawn if used too quickly. But he was good with broken things: a bicycle chain, a stove latch, a cracked water pump, a radio that only needed 1 wire cleaned and 1 screw tightened. Teachers noticed that he could sit with a problem long after other boys had thrown up their hands. He did not attack difficulty. He waited it out. He tried one angle, then another, then a third. He treated failure as information, not defeat. By 24, he was studying civil engineering. By 30, he was working on temporary bridges for relief projects. By 40, colleagues in 3 countries knew him as the man you called when a structure had to stand in bad ground with bad materials, and no time they thought he was patient by temperament. They did not know patience had once been a fence line in freezing mud. They thought he stayed late because he was thorough. They did not know leaving someone alone with a hard problem had become for Emil almost physically impossible. 32 years after the rail yard, James Cardwell stood in a reception hall in Luxembourg wearing a dark suit that still felt unnatural on his shoulders. It was 1977. An American veterans delegation had come for a memorial event. Cardwell had not wanted to go. Ruth had made him pack the good tie anyway. He was standing near a table of untouched pastries when he saw a man across the room lift a cup with both hands. Not because he needed to, because some old habits live below memory. The man had gray at his temples. His face was narrower than Cardwell remembered. But there was a stillness in him that reached back across 3 decades, the stillness of a boy who had once stood in mud while armed men decided whether his mercy counted. Cardwell crossed the room. He said, "Emil Roth." The man turned. For 1 second the years did not know where to stand. Then Emil said in careful English, "Mr. Cardwell." Cardwell laughed once, but it broke before it became laughter. They sat for 2 hours. Cardwell told him what had happened to the 13 men, who had married, who had limped, who had died early, who had lived long enough to bore grandchildren with stories they never told completely. Emil listened without interrupting. At last, Cardwell asked him the question he had carried longer than any wound. "Why did you stay?" Emil looked down at his hands. Older hands now, engineers' hands. Hands that had held slide rules, bridge plans, steel bolts, and once a canteen full of beet water. "There was a man calling for his wife," Emil said, "and the others were too weak to help him. I thought if I left he would call into the dark and no one would answer." He paused. "After that, staying was not a brave thing. It was only the next thing." Cardwell reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Ruth had told him to bring it. "You never knew," he said. He placed a photograph on the table. 13 men stood outside a hospital ward in France in May 1945. Thin, hollow-eyed, some leaning on canes, some squinting into the light, but all upright, all alive. Emil picked up the photograph the way a person lifts something recovered from a grave. For a long time he said nothing. Then he touched the corner of the picture and asked, "All of them?" "All of them," Cardwell said. Emil closed his eyes. Not for drama, not for anyone watching, just because a question he had carried since he was 15 had finally set down its weight. Emil Roth died many years later in Geneva, after a career spent building water systems, footbridges, and emergency shelters in places where ordinary plans had failed. At his memorial, colleagues said what people say when they are trying to describe a life by the marks it left on them. They said he was brilliant. They said he was gentle. They said he noticed trouble before anyone named it. They said he never walked away from a person or a problem, simply because the room had become difficult. Most of them never knew about the rail yard. They never knew about the missing rifle bolt. They never knew about the beet soup. They never knew that Patton had once stood in front of him, holding a German cap in one hand and the future of a child in the other. They knew only the pattern his life kept repeating: a bridge where there had been none, a cup of coffee placed beside someone too tired to ask, a late light still burning over a set of plans. A man who remained after remaining had stopped being convenient. That is why the story matters. Not because it changed the war. The war was already ending. not because it made powerful men merciful forever. Systems do not become holy because one decision goes right. It matters because in the last ruins of a murderous regime, when uniform, language, fear, and law all pointed in one direction, a hungry child chose a smaller, harder truth. People were hungry, people were cold, people were alone in the dark. And he could still answer. The rifle had no bolt because Emil Roth had decided, before anyone praised him, before anyone protected him, before anyone knew his name, that the war would not get that last obedience from him. That was the whole victory. A boy took the killing part out of his rifle and then spent the rest of his life building things that help people cross over.